From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good evening. I'm Anne McLean from the library's concert office. We're presenting tonight a wonderfully rich evening of music by Czech composers Antonín Dvořák and Bohuslav Martinů from the excellent Pavel Haas Quartet. It's very unusual to have on offer in one concert both the Dvořák American Quartet, Opus 96, and also the D minor Quartet, Opus 34. And we are especially pleased to be able to preface this concert with this lecture by Michael Beckerman, who's an authority on Czech composers and Eastern European music, among other subjects. Dr. Beckerman was awarded the prestigious Janáček Medal from the Czech Republic, and he is a laureate of the Czech Music Council. It's a pleasure, really, for us to welcome him back to the library. He is the Carol and Milton Petrie Professor of Music at New York University, and the author of benchmark studies on these composers we'll be hearing tonight, including one fascinating book called New Worlds of Dvorak, Searching in America for the Composer's Inner Life. And that book we have available for sale in our anteroom tonight. He's also the editor of Dvorak and His World. So let me just say also that I wanted to mention, if you're really interested in these subjects, please check out a lecture by Dr. Beckerman that is now already online on our website, Dvorak in the New World. He lectured here a few years ago, and this is on our website, www.loc.gov. And this lecture examines the role of African American sources in the conception of an American music. So please help me welcome Michael Beckerman.
Thank you. Thank you for the lovely introduction. I'm delighted to be back here at the library. Well, I thought I would begin by mentioning two composers who actually aren't on the program. And I'll begin by playing one. This piece, which sounds like late Beethoven, was actually written by a contemporary of Mozart's named Jan Jakub Ryba. He's famous for writing one of the most popular pieces in the Czech lands called the Christmas Mass, but this dissonant chromatic quartet was written long before Beethoven. And I play it to remind us all that there is really a long and distinguished tradition of Czech string quartet writing, or better yet, string quartet writing in what are known as the Czech lands. Composers like Jirovec, Gajrovec, the Stamitzes, many others, Vranickys, who are contemporaries of Mozart, wrote wonderful quartets. Certainly Smetana and his contemporaries, then Dvořák, the followers of Dvořák, Josef Suk, Förster, Novak, Martinů. There's just a long and distinguished tradition of these composers working in this medium. And it's probably pushing it to say that somehow this medium is specifically suited to the Czechs. But there are things about it, I think, points that can be made, and I'll try to make them as I go along. The second composer I'm going to mention, it will be obvious why, his works are not being played, but is Pavel Haas. Pavel Haas was a wonderful composer, a student of Janáček's, who was in Terezín, where he wrote several wonderful pieces and was killed in Auschwitz in 1945. But he was, again, an extraordinary figure and a wonderful quartet composer, a student of Janáček's, who both carried on that particular Moravian tradition or sub-tradition of Czech string quartets, but also went very much in his own direction. But we're going to begin tonight with someone from another generation, certainly not of the Dvořák-Smetana generation. This is Bohuslav Martinů. Martinů, famously born in a church tower very high above the small town of Polička, where his father was a professional fire watcher, because he was also a shoemaker, but you needed more than one job in Polička. And there are 100 steps above the church where the Martinů family lived in a small room. And he came down from the tower really only at about the age of 10. Went to Prague, studied there, was a student after my own heart because he was thrown out of school several times for incorrigible laziness. And he decided to go to Paris. And I'll get to why he decided to go to Paris in a moment, but I thought I'd begin by playing just the opening of this third string quartet, which was written in Paris in 1939. Well, anyone who actually is familiar with Martinů would probably be right to say this is quite on the dissonant edge of Martinú's writing. Martinů, again, is in Paris in 1929. He's in the thrall of many different composers, very interested in French notions of clarité, but also very much in the thrall of Stravinsky, as one can hear by these motoric rhythms. But there is one way in which Martinú's works tend to differ from those of Stravinsky and many others. And you can hear it in the next passage because of what happens when this motoric style slows down a bit. So you get all this, I don't know, Martinú's. So you get one of these sort of little syncopated passages that at various times quite specifically seem to refer to his notion of something Czech, but really become part of his style. And this is another thing. I think of Martinů, who wrote, by the time he wrote this is 1929, he was born in 1890, he's not that old. He's already written 200 pieces. Martinů is among the most prolific composers of the 20th century. He wrote, well, I once wrote an article called How Many Pieces Did Martinů Write? Because depending on how you choose to measure pieces, you get any number from 350 to 600. Is 3 etudes 3 pieces, or is it one piece called 3 etudes, things like that. But he wrote a lot of music and a lot of extraordinary music. And this aspect of his style is something you can hear even in a quite dissonant piece. I'll give you a couple of examples from maybe more famous pieces of his, of how these sort of almost insect-like textures sort of give way to this sort of syncopated sort of Martinů sound. And in that way, he strikes me as very much like a painter who has his own style. I mean, not all Jackson Pollocks are alike, but they're all Jackson Pollocks. And Martinů has certain musical fingerprints. So this is from the Sixth Symphony, much later. You get these kinds of sound. You'll hear that even in this quartet as he goes kind of in and out of these highly dissonant textures which open up into these little windows. And like a lot of pieces, this quartet ends with a kind, the movement ends with a kind of fanfare. Sorry. The second movement of this quartet is very much a kind of inward-turning lyrical piece with a lot of viola solos. And it's quite, again, an extraordinary movement that has a much more consonant center. The last movement begins like the first, as a kind of really harsh and sharp dissonant texture. And again, in the middle of the movement, we get one of these little Martinů windows opening up. Now, this is a Martinů piece, unlike some of them where there's more dissonance than you usually get in one of his pieces. And it's tricky. For a long time, I thought that, and maybe this was just sort of self-serving, that the piece was about the consonances, and that he wasn't as invested aesthetically in the dissonances as he was in those moments were the real Martinů moments. But I think that was wrong. I think they're all Martinů moments, and it's I think an exciting kind of aesthetic experience when you have, again, this level of dissonance which is opening up. And I'll make a kind of trite suggestion that I can't sort of stay away from, but Martinů did have this very strange experience of growing up in this tower. And he wrote about it quite a bit. He said, I was in the tower all the time, and in the tower, I could always see these absolutely still natural forms. I could see the fields and the shapes of the fields, and the people weren't really people. They were like little ants or something. And part of me thinks that this tendency of Martinú's to always do this, to always open out into this sort of still moment, even in the most dissonant pieces, is a part of him that might be related to that very special circumstance in which he grew up. You can take that or leave it, but I can't discount it because I think it was important enough to him. So we're going to hear two string quartets by Dvorak. One of the things I thought of titling this talk was, if we call Dvorak's Opus 96 the American Quartet, what should we call the other quartets? Should we call Martinú's the Parisian Tower? And what do we call Dvorak's non-American quartet? Do we call it a Czech quartet? So let's just begin by listening to the opening of the first movement here. So there would seem to be, to me, absolutely nothing national in it. No spices, no paprika to make Hungarian chicken or American spices, and it uses a kind of standard. So to go back and forth between major and minor, but that's something that Schubert does. This seems to be very much within the larger, particularly German quartet tradition of the composers that Dvorak loved, Mozart and Haydn, especially Schubert. Dvorak was quite reticent. He wasn't a literary man, but one of the only articles he wrote was about Schubert. So he was very much a Schubertian. Schumann, certainly Brahms. It's well known that the quartet was dedicated to Brahms. And Brahms, of course, clucked a bit and said, well, young man, I like this piece okay, but you really need to be a bit more careful around the edges. And they had that kind of relationship it's, I don't know what it says about Brahms to say that Dvorak might have been his favorite composer, but he would still wag his finger at him. But they had an extraordinary relationship, and I think he wanted to write, Dvorak very much wanted to write a quartet that fit into that tradition. Now, the quartet is not without sort of obligatory genuflections to the worlds of nation and nationality. The second movement is a polka, or alla polka. So this is just at the moment where Dvorak is figuring himself out about how he's going to bill himself, how he's going to portray himself, particularly in the German-speaking lands. This is almost like a little bit of one of his Slavonic dances that sort of intrudes into this. But you also get, as one of the wonderful moments in this quartet is the trio, the middle section of this polka, where everything stops and you get a little kind of Christmas pastoral, absolutely exquisite sort of rural moment. So there's a bit of a clash, and a wonderful one in this piece, between this sort of darker D minor opening movement, a polka, and then the polka opening up into sort of a little, almost Beethovenian image of this kind of rural bliss that's just really, an extraordinary thing, and I think it's something that Brahms noticed as well. You can hear Dvorak's debts to some of his predecessors, particularly in the last movement. Oops, sorry. That's silly. I skipped the second movement. And that's my favorite one. So let me talk about the second movement, the slow movement. The slow movement, the Adagio, is, again, one of Dvorak's great movements. It's absolutely, I think, devoid of any kind of nationalizing, any sort of genuflections in those directions. And it pursues a formal structure that many composers employed, but Dvorak to, I think, particular effect, which is it begins as a kind of romance, as a highly expressive romance, and then as the movement goes on, it simply gets more and more expressive until the very middle of the piece, where it explodes. But here's the opening of it. setting this tone of kind of reflection, prayerfulness, but also romance. So there are kind of two middles as it gets more and more intense. The first one almost suggests a kind of Spanish harmonic quality. So this is a kind of reference to something quite exotic. Dvorak loves to do that. Here's this a kind of similar passage from his famous violin romance. So, not very Czech, right? I mean, so there's a lot of languages that Dvorak is pulling on. There's Brahms in the high style. There's Czechness when he needs a polka, and there's Spanish style, little pastoral style taken from early Beethoven. But in the middle of this piece, and some of you who have heard me might know that I'm a great believer in middles. If you actually pushed me to the wall, I'd say the only purpose of outer movements is so that there can be a middle, and that all the best stuff happens in the middle. And if it's not in the middle of the movement, and here, again, just to remind you, this is the opening. Sorry. So this is the opening of the slow movement. That gesture, and when it comes back in the real, absolute center of the piece, it sounds like this. You'll hear it get up. Show. You've got the violins and octaves playing with parallel intervals. You've got the pizzicato. You've got the tremolos. Every single sort of musical sign of excess romance, of over-the-topness. And I think there are not other composers who really do this at that time. It's really and you can hear it in many other pieces by Dvorak. The slow movement of the Seventh Symphony, some of the piano trio and the piano quartet all have these. And so I think it's a real treat. I hope you look forward to it. It is, you can actually stop the quartet in the middle after that passage and ask them to play it. No, don't. Okay, and here's the last movement of it. Okay, so that opening, and then followed by. Okay, so the opening itself, is kind of reminiscent of another quartet, a favorite of Dvorak's, The Death and the Maiden. So here's Dvorak. But also reminds us a little bit of the rhythms of the Schubert Quintet in C. again, listen after the opening what happens, right? So this is the Dvorak. Fugue, a little contrapuntal passage, which I think was stolen from, let's see if I can get it right, happily stolen from, you know, I mean, he gives it back, but it is here, well, so, okay. So it's this, you know, the trio from the scherzo from the Beethoven Fifth. So he's taken that from Schubert and he's taken that from Beethoven. But the amazing thing is he's put them together. You know, he's put them together, one right next to the other, and it creates a really powerful effect. So, you know, this is quite an astonishing piece, this quartet, with enormous power. Dvorak was a young man when he wrote it, and it really is one of his great early works. So, I'm back here at this podium where I was some years ago trying to talk about Dvorak's American works. What it means that a composer who thought of himself as Czech got on a boat, landed in New York, and decided that he would try to write American music. It was an astonishing thing. It's still an astonishing thing. And the F major quartet is one of the greatest products. So first, let me go over quickly, some of you may know it, the story of Dvorak and the United States. He was brought to the United States by an extraordinary woman named Jeanette Thurber. Jeanette Thurber was a brilliant woman who decided that the United States should try to hold its own with Europe in terms of musical culture. She started opera companies. She believed in opera in English. She had for its time, or maybe honestly for any time, the astonishing idea that anybody should be able to study music regardless of their background, their color, their level, their economic level, their religion, their gender. She wanted to create an institution that would be open to all. And she fastened on Dvorak because she knew that Dvorak came from humble circumstances and thought that he would make a marvelous leader for her National Conservatory, which she started on East 17th Street, now the site of Washington Irving High School, but formerly the site of the National Conservatory. She paid Dvorak what we already know was a princely wage in 1893, 92, 93 to come to the United States. And the reasons that she wanted Dvorak were, I think, threefold. The first, again, she wanted to create an institution in the United States that would be of such high quality that students would not feel the need to go to Europe to finish their musical education. So she thought, well, let's get the best people in the world. Let's use American know-how and especially money to hire some of the best people so that people didn't have to go abroad. The second, as I've already mentioned, she wanted to have an institution which she felt was true to the principles of this country, of the ideals of this country that would be open to everybody. And if people couldn't pay, their tuition would be paid. It didn't matter what their background was. So she had many women students, African-American students, students from all kinds of backgrounds. But the third thing she wanted, and this is really where Dvorak came in, whether it's a wrong-headed idea from the get-go or not is something you all can decide over time. I think there are many perspectives, but she wanted a music that would sound American the way she thought Russian music was Russian, Hungarian music was Hungarian, and Czech music was Czech. She wanted something that would be an equivalent, and she brought, if you can view it as an experiment, that she's a scientist, and she brought Dvorak over as an experiment. By the way, I'm just reminded as I'm speaking, one of the great science fiction stories I ever read is called A Work of Art by James Blish. It's online, you can read it. And hundreds of years, or maybe 1,000 years in the future, I can't quite remember, they recreate Richard Strauss out of some scientific principle so that he can write works for them, but he can't because he's out of his time. But this is a kind of an experiment. She's bringing Dvorak to America, and she's saying, okay, I'm going to give you all kinds of cues, and let's see what it means to write American music. So Dvorak arrives in the United States October 1892. If you do your math, October 12th, 1892 is not the 500th, but the 400th anniversary of Columbus. There are many talks about the New World of Music, a title that gets picked up by Dvorak later for a work that some of you may know, the New World Symphony. And additionally, he hears that first week, because his hotel is right over one of the main parade routes, all sort of the music of America, blacksmiths, choirs, spirituals are marching under his window. Not only that, he's famous. He's incredibly famous. And as you know, all of you, I'm sure, who are all famous, that when you're famous, people give you things. People just come up to you and they give you things. And so everyone's giving Dvorak music, and they're saying, look at this music, write with this. And one of the real preoccupations of Jeanette Thurber was the idea that Dvorak should fuse the local styles of the United States to create something Czech. And that meant, to her mind, not only the various styles of Celtic music or French music, but primarily, in her view, African American and Native American. Dvorak very quickly seems to fall in love with African American song. There are, I think, many reasons for it. Reason one, he was hearing some extraordinary music that he'd never heard before. Another thing was Dvorak was deeply religious. And as you may know, Czech folk songs generally are about drinking wine and chasing girls. And suddenly he found what he thought was an American folk music, which was biblical. It was all about Daniel in the lion's den and Go Down Moses. He very quickly hooked up with Harry T. Burleigh, who was studying at the school and also working there, who was an extraordinary singer, whose grandfather had been a slave. And as Burleigh walked with his grandfather in Erie, Pennsylvania, his grandfather became a lamplighter. The grandfather sang all these songs for Burleigh. And so to Dvorak, Burleigh seemed like an authentic source for what this music was. Dvorak also was in with a group of people who felt that because of the history of slavery, it wasn't only that African American music was expressive or very expressive, that it was the most expressive, that it was the music that should be the foundation for an American style. And Dvorak, in a long interview with a yellow journalist named James Creelman, whose signature, he signed that over, the picture was signed over to Creelman, to my dear friend James Creelman, that he said in this article, the future of American music should be based on black music. He had found this also in an article written by a wonderful woman named Mildred Hill, who wrote an article under the pseudonym Johann Tanzor called Negro Music, that argued the same thing, that the future of American music should be black, that this is where the source should be. And Dvorak took this very much to heart. The New World Symphony is steeped in these, and, swing low. And Dvorak cuts out the first measure and, sorry, it's too small a keyboard. I have to sing the top. So we have this sort of reliance on black melody, certain levels of expression that were really new to Dvorak. So Dvorak writes the New World Symphony in the winter and the spring of 1893. In May of 1893, he gives this interview with the New York Herald where he basically says, American music should be based on black models. And there's a huge controversy around it. People argue, some agree, some disagree. Can this really be the source for American music? Dvorak wants to get away from it all, so he ends up going out to Spillville, Iowa. Spillville, Iowa was a Czech colony that goes back to the 1830s and 40s. He went there because his secretary, who was an American-born Czech named Josef Kovařík, his family lived there. And suddenly, after all this very stressful time writing the symphony, getting involved in this controversy, he finds himself in nature. He finds himself in the middle of Iowa, and where everybody actually, all the people there are came over in the 1840s. So they all talk like his grandparents, even though they're his age. So he sits around with these farmers and he drinks beer and he feels like he's at home again, and he snaps his fingers and writes two of the greatest works in the chamber music repertoire. The first, the American Quartet, was written in a flash. It was written in less than 2 weeks. And I think it's an extraordinary work in many ways. First of all, it's Dvorak again in his American style. Here's the opening, the famous opening of the quartet. So this kind of sort of huge spaces. That's another aspect of the American style. So-called 5-note scales, right? But also the space of it. So you have a sense of Dvorak's sense of openness and space. It's not that different from, sorry. The New World Symphony's main theme is, this is, so they have that sense of expansiveness, of energy, of reaching. Okay, since I threw a little autobiographical bit in talking about Martinů, I think that there is a kind of slight autobiographical tinge to this. I think this work almost hinges sometimes on the manic. And I think Dvorak was so extraordinarily excited to get back, to get into nature, to be himself again after being in the city, that this opening sound of Dvorak was famously a violist. I think that's sort of, I'm back. Not literally, but just so that you know, this is a guy who wrote a piece called Song of the Hero, which was an autobiographical work, He wrote other kind of autobiographical things. There's a very long-standing tradition, well, not that long, but Smetana's famous quartet was autobiographical, From My Life. And I think this is a kind of, Dvorak has put himself into it, much in the same way I think he puts himself as a kind of character into that other great bookend work of the American years, that is the cello concerto. Well, perhaps the most extraordinary movement in this quartet is the slow movement, is the middle movement again. I think Dvorak did find this whole beautiful part of Iowa extraordinary, but one thing he kept saying that sometimes he says, it's so wild here. It's so wild that this is sad unto despair. It's like a desert. And I think that's something he tried to capture in the second movement. So this is really an extraordinary. You get these kinds of harmonies where, and Dvorak loves those sort of, nothing really happens. It's not as if you have a sense of harmonic movement. It's as if the lights shifted a little bit. And so you get this, and this is written, I think, in the, at least partially, in this Schubertian sort of heavenly length tradition. It just really goes on and on. There's no real pause. It just keeps unfolding and intensifying in a way that's really quite marvelous. It has the quality of lament to it. And several times people have referred to it as a kind of Indian lament. And that's one of the chapters of Dvorak's time in the United States which is most poorly understood, and I don't know if we ever will. Well, when Dvorak's first great biographer in English, John Clapham, wrote about Dvorak's time in Iowa, he became puzzled because there was a reference to the Kickapoo. And he wanted to know what tribe the Kickapoo were. But in fact, there was no Kickapoo tribe there. There was something called the Kickapoo Medicine Show that Dvorak heard. And the Kickapoo Medicine Show was a kind of pan-American music. It had an African-American banjo player. It had people from different tribes. It was a little bit of a show. So we really don't know what he heard. But it's likely that he was taken by this, although his reactions to it were ambivalent. We don't know quite what he thought. But in any case, there was a tendency to tie Dvorak to this. But there's also another thing in this particular movement which is redolent of Dvorak. Dvorak had something of a reputation of being an unproblematic, happy Czech. And yet, his works are filled with funerals and funeral marches. The symphonic poems almost all have funeral marches. In the middle of the Largo of the New World Symphony, there's a passage based on the death of Minnehaha from the Song of Hiawatha. The cello concerto, slow movement, has a funeral interruption. And at the very end of this movement, there's some kind of the constant sound which has gone on and on for 5 or 6 minutes stops, and we have a kind of funeral march. So some kind of Prairie Funeral being enacted in the course of this. Now, we don't actually know exactly what to do with pieces of music, right? Because, you have this inner longing, sighing, deep, maybe even anguish, and then here's the next movement. What are you supposed to do with that? Nobody really knows. Right? I mean, it really is an astonishing contrast. And this movement is also another way that Dvorak tried to make American music, and maybe he can be forgiven for doing it too obviously. So again, here's the opening. So that passage there, we're told that Dvorak, while he was writing this, sort of became a little bit obsessed with the sound of a black bird or with red wings or red wing, we're not quite sure what, but we pretty much think it's this. Scarlet Tanager. And that Dvorak was trying, one of the ways that he tried to make his music American was to stick an American bird in it, because how could you say it's not American? And so we hear this in various different times. So here's another one. Those are the robin and the bluebird, taken out of a book of bird songs and stuck right into the New World Symphony. Magpies and blue jays in the scherzo of the New World Symphony. So Dvorak decided that in his scherzo, he would stick in the sounds of this tanager. And so we have this sort of full picture. We have the sadness of the prairie, we have the energy of coming into the country, and then we have these sort of extraordinary bird songs. The last movement combines a lot of these things, because we have a kind of celebratory. So again, what are these sounds? It's these simple sounds. The kinds of things he was hearing in black music, that he was sometimes hearing in Native American music, these little phrases that come together, but also an extraordinary sense of lyrical expansiveness. This is the second theme in the last movement. I mean, you know, you can name 70 film scores that come right out of this sound, which was a very influential sound. But then in the middle of the movement, exact middle of the movement, he does something a little bit unusual. A kind of reminiscence of the mood of the slow movement. The second movement kind of comes back in this celebratory last movement to once more sort of suggest a more reflective mode. You know, writing a piece of music is both someone like Dvorak quite natural, but also extremely complex. You're always asking, how much of this do I do before I do some of that? And what's the effect of that going to be? And if I want to say this, how do I say it? If what I really want to say is the middle, how do I surround it with various parts? And in a piece like this, just as I think Mrs. Thurber was experimenting with what it meant to try to make American music, Dvorak was using all these new ideas combined with his old ones, because the people who don't like this notion of Dvorak trying to write American music will always point out that Dvorak used some of these same ideas when he was in the Czech lands, in Bohemia. That would be like saying somebody who comes over from Japan to paint the American West isn't painting the American West because they're using a tree. Well, I mean, everyone has a basic technique. You don't lose your basic technique simply because you find new inspirations. But what Dvorak tried to do, I think, was to quite consciously do what Mrs. Thurber wanted him to do, which was, again, to create an American music that was like his Czech music. I think, and this is crude, that she thought he had made Czech music by taking a basic model, a German model really, of music, and putting Czechisms in. And she sort of wanted him to take out the Czechisms and put in Americanisms. And one of the ways he did that was by not putting in Czechisms. So there's very little in any of these American period works that even by name or deed or sound suggest polka, suggest anything other than American style. But there's every evidence that Dvorak believed in this, and that he believed that he should try to show American composers what it meant to write American music. Well, whether you want to take the view of some people and say this led directly to Gershwin, to Copland, and to Duke Ellington, as my colleague Maurice Perez would say, or whether you're a little bit more skeptical about how Dvorak's American language was received, there's no doubt that he tried to do it. And the best proof of that was a remark he made in some anger to his student and amanuensis, Josef Kowarczyk. He said, this is after he'd written these pieces, he came back, New World Symphony was premiered, all kinds of angry cries. There's no such thing as American music. Who do you think you are? You don't know anything. You come from Bohemia. You're going to teach us. Go away. And Dvorak wrote, said, you know, they call me an American composer, you know, but I'm not. I just tried to show them what it would be like to be an American composer, but I'm not doing that anymore. And I think by and large, he stopped doing it. So the fact that he was doing it is the evidence, in effect, that he stopped. So these, again, are extraordinary pieces. Whether you choose to call this one the American, Martinů's the Parisian, and Dvorak's earlier one the Habsburg, because it seems to combine all the styles that you would want to have together, or you just simply think of them as extraordinary pieces of music, doesn't really matter much. But what does matter is the kinds of intensity and combinations and contrasts that you get in these pieces. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, we have just a few moments if anybody would like to ask some questions from Dr. Beckerman.
Yes, please. Yes.
Back to Martinů. Who were some of his musical influences, if any? Because he doesn't really sound much like anyone else.
Well, I mean, that's, you know, the best thing I ever read about influence, not that I really understand it, is that the reason it's so difficult to talk about it, because the most profound influences act over a long period from a great distance, so it's always tricky to pick them up. But I think there are several. I mean, I think he was very much taken with this Dvorak school. You know, I think in many ways, even though his music sounds different, in terms of the kinds of pieces that he wrote, he chose to follow that. He studied with Josef Suk, you know, Dvorak's son-in-law, and I think, again, I think he was influenced by this tradition. And again, it's tricky to sort of make generalizations like this because they stick and they ought not to, but you know, this was a tradition of non-virtuosos. You know, Suk himself, even though he was the leader of the Bohemian Quartet, was a second violinist. Martinů was a second violinist. Dvorak was a violist. And I think something of the kind of workmanlike, somewhat modest part of the tradition comes out, and I think he knew those works. A little bit, I think he was interested in Janacek, and I think that comes out sometimes in the operas. I was, yeah. I mean, the person I spoke to most about this was a little tricky, was Rudolf Verkushny, who was a student of Janacek's and a very good friend of Martinů's, and he. Now, Martinů also was, I think, very taken with Albert Roussel and the French style. He studied with Roussel, and he was, you know, active and influenced. There's an extremely strong Stravinskyan influence in a lot of pieces from that period. But I think the sort of the Martinů style that he cultivates really from the 1930s on, I mean, again, it draws on Czech folklore, it draws on Slovak music, it draws on Czech pastoral traditions. He richly draws on a lot, but I don't think there is that kind of influence. I think you're right. Thanks. Please, yes.
Was there any overlap with Smetana's lifetime, and was there any influence with the Moldau in any of Dvorak's work?
Yeah, I think certainly. I mean, Smetana was unavoidable to Dvorak for many reasons. One of the greatest was that he played under Smetana's baton played as a second violinist, and Smetana was the conductor of the orchestra of the Provisional Theater, and so he obviously learned an enormous amount from Smetana. And I think he admired Smetana. There was a certain level of rivalry. Dvorak's Slavonic dances were extraordinarily successful. And it sort of illustrates a little bit, that Harold Bloom anxiety of influence, because people often like to tell happy stories. People often like to tell happy stories about the relationship between composers, how they help each other, and Haydn loves Mozart, but Bloom thinks of this more as mortal combat. And I don't know how mortal it was, but when Dvorak had this enormous success with the Slavonic dances, Smetana kind of shook his finger and wrote a series of quite wonderful, not as popular as Dvorak, but wonderful pieces called the Czech dances, because he felt that Dvorak's dances were not Czech enough. And he wanted to show him what it meant, and what it meant to write Czech music for Smetana was to apply the highest level intellectual traditions of modern music, but somehow referring to local things. And I think he felt Dvorak was too international. And unfortunately, this became a very ugly battle, not between Dvorak and Smetana, who were mostly gone by the time the biggest battles erupted, but it's well known that Smetana's champion was a kind of mustachioed intellectual villain named Zdeněk Nejedlý, who gained more power than a musicologist should ever have. By the time the communists took power, he became the Minister of Culture. But long before that, he had basically taught generations of students to worship Smetana and Fibic, and to revile Dvorak as a kind of bloated cosmopolitan who simply, whatever good qualities he might have had, he was simply showing Czech music the wrong way forward. So these kinds of things intrude even now into the literature.
When did the Moldau, when was that?
That was actually composed almost just before this quartet. So yeah, I mean, the two of them were dipping into many, if you'll forgive the terrible pun, the same streams. Yes, any more questions? Yes.
You commented that Dvorak felt that American music should be influenced or maybe even led by African American music. Can you tell us some of the composers or influencers or musicians that he might have heard and been impressed by?
Well, I think his love affair. Look, I mean, the bottom line is that most of what happened in the past we don't know, right? So there's just so many encounters that he might have had that we know nothing about. The ones we know about primarily are either his encounters with notated music or his encounters with specific musicians. And the one who was most influential in that regard, from a lot of different sources, you don't necessarily believe any one source, but if you have a whole range of people who don't know each other who all seem to say the same thing. So the relationship between Harry Burleigh and Dvorak, that was one profound way that he heard black music. He knew this Cicerietta Jones, who was considered the Black Patti, and a singer, and she also sang for him. He probably encountered more musicians, but we don't actually know that much about them. He had one or two African American students, and it's quite possible. I mean, the famous. Sorry, I'll have to change the key. Right, the famous Humoresque sounds very much like one of the Plantation songs written by one of his students. But he was an ardent student of these things. He was given musical notation, he was given articles, and again, I believe that his first interest in this was piqued when he met Burleigh and at the same time read this article that not only spoke about the expressive quality of African American music, but gave several musical examples, and at the same time argued that these examples should be the foundation of a music. Well, even if it was a pretext, even if Dvorak was being paid a lot of money to make American music, he had to figure out how to make it, and pretty quickly. And I think it's when he heard these songs that he felt this has got to be, this is my clay out of which I'm going to make it. And I don't think he ever really deviated from that. But you're right, there are not that many sources for, other than Burley and one or two of his students, of musicians that he heard, although we assume that he must have heard many. Thank you.
So wonderful. This is fantastic. I'm sorry to have to cut you off, but I know you're going to love this concert. Thank you so much to Dr. Beckerman.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.